Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
It's amazing how far we've come with cancer treatments, but it's still mind-boggling that what works incredibly well for one person might not do a thing for someone else.
It really is.
And this is especially true with something like colorectal cancer, which we know is so common.
Definitely a big one.
So today we're diving deep into some new research,
Yeah.
taking a close look at immunotherapy treatments
Yeah.
and how they're working out for people with colorectal cancer in the real world.
That's right.
We're talking about real people, not just those in clinical trials.
Exactly.
So we've got two great sources for this deep dive, a health news article that lays things out really nicely, and a heavy-duty scientific paper from JAMA Network Open.
The Journal of the American Medical Association.
That's the one.
Yes.
So we're talking serious research here.
Absolutely. And they looked at data from nearly 19,000 patients in the U.S.
Wow, 19,000, that's huge.
A huge number who received these treatments called immune checkpoint inhibitors for their colorectal cancer.
So that's a ton of real-world experience to learn from.
Absolutely.
And that's what we're here for today.
All right, let's do it.
To really grasp how these high-tech treatments are doing when they're used in everyday practice.
Right, outside those controlled clinical trials.
Exactly, because that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
So we want to uncover what might be influencing whether these treatments work or not,
Yeah, makes sense.
and how this could impact a wider range of people, people like you who are trying to navigate all this complex health information.
Absolutely.
So let's jump into the study. What exactly were these researchers trying to find out?
Well, the main thing they wanted to see was how these immune checkpoint inhibitor treatments, specifically the ones targeting proteins called programmed cell death protein 1
Okay.
and programmed death ligand 1, how these actually work in a diverse group of colorectal cancer patients, everyday people receiving routine medical care.
Right, the real world.
The real world. They wanted to know if those amazing results we saw in early trials actually held up in a larger group.
So do they work as well in the real world as they did in the lab?
That's it. And they were also curious about any factors that might be linked to whether a patient got these treatments in the first place and how well they worked.
So are there certain things that make someone more likely to receive these treatments or more likely to respond to them?
Precisely.
Fascinating. So how did they tackle this investigation? What was their approach?
They did a population-based cohort study, a huge one.
Okay, so break that down for me. What exactly does that mean?
Think of it like a digital family tree, but with health records.
Okay.
They dug into a bunch of electronic health records from nearly 19,000 patients,
Wow.
all diagnosed with cancer that had spread from the colon or rectum to other parts of the body.
That's called metastatic colorectal cancer, right?
That's right.
Okay, just so we're all on the same page.
Exactly. And this all happened between January 2013 and June 2019.
Okay, so fairly recent data.
Relatively recent.
Got it.
And all this info came from a big nationwide database.
That's super valuable, having such a large pool of information to draw from.
It really is. And it's important to remember, we're not doing any new experiments here. It's all about observation.
Right. Not intervening, just observing.
We're looking for patterns and connections in the data in these thousands of real-life treatment journeys.
So they're looking at what already happened to these patients to find clues.
Precisely.
So they weren't running new trials. They were just sort of sifting through existing medical records to see what they could find out.
Exactly.
That's a really clever approach. What specifically were they looking for in those records?
Well, they wanted to see which patients got the immune checkpoint inhibitors and then what happened to them.
Okay.
Specifically, how long did they live
Mm-hmm.
and how long did they stay on the treatment before stopping for whatever reason.
So it's not just about whether the treatment worked initially, but whether it kept working over time.
You got it.
Okay.
And they compared all of that to patients who only received chemotherapy,
The kind of standard treatment
the
approach.
standard of care.
Got it. So we're comparing those two groups. Now, I know colorectal cancer isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, right? There are different types, and I imagine those might respond differently to treatment.
You're exactly right.
Did they take that into account?
Absolutely they did. They looked closely at whether the patient's tumor had something called high microsatellite instability or if it was microsatellite stable.
Oh, boy. Those are some big words. Break those down for us. What do those terms actually mean?
Okay, so basically these are different ways to describe tumors based on their genetic makeup,
Okay.
and they act differently. Importantly, the ones with high microsatellite instability, or MSI H as they're often called,
MSI H, got it.
those have generally shown a much better response to immunotherapy in the past.
So those are the ones we're more hopeful about when it comes to immunotherapy.
Right.
Okay, so they were looking at how these two different tumor types responded to treatment in this huge group of patients, and also trying to find any links between patient characteristics and how well the treatments worked.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, lay it on us. What were the big findings here?
Well, the most exciting thing was that for patients with metastatic colorectal cancer,
Meaning it had spread.
yes, that had spread, and that was MSI-H.
High microsatellite instability.
Right. The study really solidified what we'd seen in earlier trials, that immune checkpoint inhibitors made a big difference in their survival.
So that's fantastic news for people with that type of colorectal cancer.
Really good news.
It seems like these treatments really are delivering on their promise in the real world, at least for that group. What about those with microsatellite stable tumors, the MSS type? Those are usually tougher to treat with immunotherapy, aren't they?
That's right. And as we expected, patients with MSI-H tumors were way more likely to get the immune checkpoint inhibitors.
Makes sense. If they tend to respond better, doctors are going to be more likely to prescribe them.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's where it gets even more interesting. The study actually found a few factors that seemed to affect how well these immune checkpoint inhibitors worked, even in some of the patients with MSS tumors.
Oh, really? Now that's surprising. I thought those tumors were generally less responsive to this kind of treatment. What did they find?
So they found that people with MSS tumors who had high levels of a protein called albumin in their blood tended to live longer when they got immunotherapy.
Albumin, is that something commonly measured in blood tests?
Yeah, it's a standard part of many blood tests.
Okay, so it's information that doctors would already have.
That's right.
And it might be a clue as to who could benefit from this treatment, even with an MSS tumor.
Potentially, yes.
That's fascinating. Anything else?
They also found a link between using antibiotics and longer survival in these MSS patients who are on immunotherapy.
Antibiotics, that's really unexpected. Why would antibiotics have anything to do with cancer treatment?
It is surprising. And to be clear, the researchers acknowledge that this is just an association, not necessarily cause and effect.
Okay, so we can't say for sure that the antibiotics are directly responsible for the longer survival, but there's a connection there.
Right. It might have something to do with changes in the gut bacteria, the microbiome.
Ah, that makes sense. We're learning more and more about how important our gut bacteria are for overall health. Could it be that they're somehow influencing the immune response to cancer and these immunotherapy drugs?
It's definitely a possibility. It's a complex area, and we need more research to really understand what's going on.
Right, more to explore there. What about other factors? Did they find anything else that seemed to influence outcomes for these MSS patients?
Yeah, they also found that patients who were diagnosed with metastatic cancer right from the start, what's called synchronous metastatic colorectal cancer.
So stage 4 at the initial diagnosis, meaning the cancer had already spread?
Yes, exactly. Those patients tended to have shorter survival times on immunotherapy.
Oh, so the timing of when the cancer spreads might actually matter.
It seems that way, at least in this study.
That's an important distinction for people to be aware of. Did they compare that to people whose cancer spread later, after the initial diagnosis?
Yes, they did. They compared them to patients whose cancer spread later, which is called metachronous metastatic colorectal cancer.
And did that group do better on immunotherapy?
They did.
So for someone listening, if they were diagnosed with metastatic cancer right away, this finding suggests that their response to immunotherapy might be different than someone whose cancer spread later.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really something to consider when discussing treatment options with your doctor. Okay, so we've got some factors that seem to be linked with better outcomes for those with MSS tumors, and one that seems to be linked with worse outcomes. Anything else that stood out from the findings?
Yeah, there's one more really important finding. Despite the fact that MSS tumors are generally considered less responsive to these immune checkpoint inhibitors, they actually found that a decent chunk of patients with these tumors did show a lasting response to the treatment.
Really? How many are we talking about?
Over 12%.
12%. That's not insignificant.
No, not at all.
Especially considering that we thought this type of cancer was largely resistant to immunotherapy. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it?
It is. It suggests that there's a group of people out there with this tough-to-treat tumor type who can actually benefit from these drugs.
And we just need to figure out how to identify them.
Exactly.
Okay, let's step back and look at the big picture here. What are the main takeaways from this study for patients and doctors?
Okay, so first, it really backs up the idea that immunotherapy is a strong treatment option for patients with metastatic colorectal cancer. That's MSI H.
The high microsatellite instability type.
Right. This analysis, with its massive real-world data set,
Yeah, 19,000 patients.
exactly.
Yeah.
It just provides strong support for what we've been seeing in those more controlled clinical trials.
So for those patients, it's good news, reinforcing what we thought we knew. What about those with the MSS type?
For them, these findings open up some very cool possibilities for future research.
Like what?
Well, the fact that they found these correlations with albumin levels
Yeah.
and antibiotic use hints that we might be able to figure out which MSS patients are the ones who could really benefit from immunotherapy.
We just need to find those extra clues, those biomarkers or whatever they are, that tell us, okay, this person with an MSS tumor is actually likely to respond well to this treatment.
Exactly. It's like a
Yeah.
whole new frontier.
Absolutely. Anything else about implications for the future?
Yeah, this study also suggests that things like the bacteria in our gut and our general health might be way more important than we thought in how we respond to treatment.
Even for cancers that haven't typically responded well to immunotherapy.
Exactly. It's like we're starting to understand that the body's overall ecosystem plays the role in how effective these treatments are.
I like that the body's ecosystem, it's all connected, isn't it?
It really seems that way.
Now, what about that finding regarding synchronous metastatic cancer?
Oh, right. That's important too. Knowing that those folks might not do as well on immunotherapy.
The ones whose cancer had already spread at diagnosis.
Right. That really helps us understand who might not benefit as much, and it can definitely guide treatment choices.
And hopefully it can help us find ways to overcome that resistance in the future.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like this study is a big deal. It looks at a huge group of people in a real-world setting, not just in a controlled lab environment.
Exactly. And that gives us so much more to work with.
It gives us a much broader perspective than clinical trials alone, right?
It really does. You know, clinical trials, they have really strict rules about who can participate.
Right.
And so sometimes the results don't quite show us the whole picture.
They might not apply to everyone with the disease, just the select group who qualified for the trial.
Exactly.
But this study looks at how these treatments are actually working in everyday care, and that's super valuable.
It is, both for patients and their doctors. Now, of course, every study has its limitations. What were some of the constraints of this one?
Well, they pointed out that because they were working with electronic health records, sometimes information was missing.
Oh, that makes sense. You can only work with what you've got.
Exactly.
What kind of information was missing?
Well, sometimes they didn't have all the genetic details about the tumors or really specific information on side effects.
Okay.
And they didn't always have records of past surgeries.
That makes sense. Those are all things that could potentially influence how someone responds to treatment.
Right. So having that full picture would have been even better, but it wasn't always available.
And even with those limitations, this study still provides some incredibly valuable insights.
Absolutely.
What else should we keep in mind when interpreting these findings?
It's important to remember that a lot of what they found were associations.
Meaning they found connections, but not necessarily direct cause and effect.
Right, like with the antibiotics. They saw a link between antibiotic use and longer survival, but they can't say for sure that the antibiotics were the reason for that longer survival.
Exactly. There could be other factors at play that we haven't identified yet.
So these findings are like intriguing clues, but we need more research to really understand what they mean.
You got it. And the researchers themselves said that their findings, especially about the MSS tumors,
Right.
those really need to be checked out in bigger, more focused studies.
So we can't jump to conclusions and start changing treatment protocols just yet.
Not quite yet, but it gives us some good directions to explore.
Okay, that's fair. Now, we also got some expert opinions on this study. What were some of the key takeaways from them?
So Dr. Stephanie Schmidt,
One of the lead researchers.
yes, she emphasized that clinical trials, while important, don't always tell us how a treatment will work for everybody.
Because they have those strict criteria about who can participate.
Right. So she highlighted how important it is to look at real-world data like this.
To see how things are actually shaking out in everyday practice.
Exactly. And she also pointed out how interesting those lasting responses were in some of the patients with the MSS tumors.
Yeah, that was really surprising.
It was. And she thinks that things like enzyme levels and the activity of the microbiome, all those little microorganisms living in us.
Right, the gut bacteria and all that.
Yeah, she thinks those could be playing a role in how those tumors respond to immunotherapy.
Fascinating. So our internal environment might be a bigger factor than we realized.
It might be. What about Dr. Matejic? What did he have to say?
Okay, so Dr. Marko Matejic,
Right.
the data scientist who was the first author on the study,
He really wanted to make sure that the success they saw with immune checkpoint inhibitors in clinical trials for the MSI H tumors.
so those tumors that generally respond well,
Right. He wanted to make sure that was also happening in regular doctors' offices.
that it wasn't just a fluke of the clinical trial setting.
Exactly. And thankfully, their findings did confirm that.
That's reassuring.
It is. And he's also hopeful that their work could eventually lead to better survival for those with the MSS colorectal cancer.
Who don't currently have a good immunotherapy option.
Right. And he also agreed that we need more, larger studies to back up their findings.
To solidify what they found.
Yes, and then hopefully use that info to create new treatment guidelines.
To actually change how we approach treatment for these patients.
Exactly. So it's exciting stuff.
It really is. Okay, so let's bring this all home for our listeners. What should they be taking away from all of this?
All right. So if you or someone you care about has been diagnosed with metastatic colorectal cancer and the tumor is MSI H.
High microsatellite instability, the type that tends to respond well to immunotherapy.
Right. These findings really reinforce how important it is to talk about immunotherapy with your oncologist.
As a possible treatment option.
Yes. Potentially even as the first treatment you try.
Okay, that's great advice. What about for those with the MSS tumors, the ones that haven't been as responsive to immunotherapy?
For them, it's a bit more complicated. Right now, there aren't as many approved uses for immunotherapy with these tumors.
Right.
But this research offers a glimmer of hope. We're learning so much so quickly about cancer treatment and the fact that some people with these tumors did well on immunotherapy and that things like albumin levels and antibiotic use might be important.
Right.
All of that tells us there's still a lot to discover.
So don't lose hope. There's still a lot of research happening and new possibilities emerging all the time.
Exactly. Stay informed. Talk to your doctor about the latest research and about any clinical trials that might be a good fit for you.
Great advice. Don't be afraid to ask questions and advocate for yourself. Knowledge is power.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. If things like the bacteria in our gut or even our nutritional status can impact how well these cutting-edge cancer therapies work.
It's wild, isn't it?
It is. What other surprising connections might we find between our bodies and how we respond to treatment? This just shows how incredibly complex cancer is and why we need to keep pushing forward with research to find those truly personalized and effective treatments for everyone.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground today. This was a really fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.